Thank you for being with us. I want to welcome you. If you're new with us here at Blackhawk, then just sit back and relax. Know you're amongst friends and family today. I want to welcome our online family as well, watching us in PJs or whatever you're up to today, getting in that last little bit before school starts this week. Can you believe that school has arrived or is arriving today? We're excited to have you as a part of what God is up to here at Blackhawk. We're in a series called Come to the Table, and I want to invite you to Luke's Gospel. The book of Luke in your New Testament will be in chapter 7 today. We kicked it off last week, and the premise behind this series is that we are called to come to the table. And in looking at Luke's Gospel, we're identifying 10 times where Jesus had a meal with someone in Luke's gospel. And it's during those times where Jesus had a meal with others where we get to do two things. We get to see, number one, the heart of Jesus. We get to understand who Jesus is. And number two, we really get to see what his heart is for us as his church, because it's at meals where we really get to know each other at a deep level. And so today I invite you to Luke chapter 7. Will be the second week of this series. And last week we were in Luke chapter 5 and the calling of Matthew, who was a tax collector. It's the same Matthew, he's known as Levi in that text, but Matthew wrote Matthew's gospel that is the beginning of your New Testament. And we go from one extreme to another now. So Jesus had a meal with Levi, Matthew, at his house, so a tax collector, the worst of the worst. If you missed last week, you want to learn more about how they were the worst of the worst, go back and check that out at blackhawkministries.org. You can learn more about them. But then we go to the other extreme. So we go from the extreme of tax collector, meal last week, meal this week, Luke chapter 7, to the religiously elite's house, the Pharisees, the ones who were the ultimate example of following God's law during the time. And so that's where we go today. His name was Simon. And it's in Luke chapter 7 that Jesus really further clarifies, further solidifies, and helps us understand this critically acclaimed title that he got to of friend of sinners. It's the same chapter, Luke 7, verse 34, where Jesus, in his own words, is describing how he was being compared to John the Baptist. And in verse 34, this is what is said about him, especially when it comes to eating. And so if you like food, this is the series for you. And then we even want to equip you. You'll hear more about it with some coupons at restaurants. Why are we doing that? Because we want to encourage you to go invite people to come to the table outside of the walls of these buildings, to be the church, to have meals with others, hopefully in some of the ways that Jesus did. But it's Luke, because he did that, Luke 7:34, Jesus describes this as the Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. The first part of that, obviously not true, a glutton or a drunkard, but the second part, I am so glad that my Jesus became known, and what he was accused to be known for was true of him, that he was a friend of sinners. I'm glad of that. Are you glad of that today? I'm excited to preach. You're going to help me preach today? I want you to dive into this with me. And so in Luke 7, he digs into that further, but a few things you should know before we read it. First of all, this passage in the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll find oftentimes parallel accounts, or these accounts of the gospel stories, the life, the ministry of Jesus. And a lot of times they're the same stories told from different vantage points, different perspectives, different angles. But today's story, even though it looks very similar to stories in Matthew and in Mark and in John, is actually a story that's unique to Luke. And it's going to look really similar to the stories that are told in Matthew, Mark, and John that took place closer to the time of the crucifixion, where Jesus would go and be a sacrifice for the sins of mankind at the place called Bethany, Lazarus' sister. And this is a different story, a unique story, although there are a lot of similarities in the story. Some scholars believe that the sinful woman that you've even heard sung about is Mary Magdalene, who is mentioned throughout Scripture. We only know her in the passage as the sinful woman, and we're going to learn a lot about her as well as a lot about the home of the guy, Simon, the Pharisee, who hosted this meal. And so as we look at this, here's what you should know. You say, what does all that matter? What it shows you is just how frequent and how normal it is for Jesus to have the kinds of interactions like what we're going to read about today. And I hope that it opens your eyes to how you are a lot like some of the people in the story. You ready for God's word today? Luke chapter 7, I want to start in verse 36, read the whole passage there to the end of the chapter through verse 50. So grab your devices, your Bibles. I'm going to read from the English Standard Version today. So dig in. Somebody once asked, well, what version of the Bible should you do? I'd say start with the one you'll read. So dig in there. We're going to read from the ESV today, Luke chapter 7, verse 36. Here's how the story begins from God's word. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him and went to the Pharisee's house and took his place at the table. The best seat, perhaps. Verse 37, and behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, not out loud, to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. Jesus, answering him, said, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. And he says this parable in verse 41, a certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And Jesus said to him, you have judged rightly. Then, turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Verse 49, then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. That is the story from God's word, and there's so much there, and I want to unpack all that is there, or at least some of it today with you, and really give you two things that come from this passage, starting with verses 36 through 40, and what you're going to see is that Luke is contrasting this religiously elite Pharisee, this religious leader who had everything together, one would think. He's going to contrast his story and his sinfulness with that of the sinful woman, who most scholars would believe is probably a prostitute. It doesn't say that. It says that she is a sinful woman, but we know she has a sinful reputation. And for a woman in this time to be known in the city as sinners, we talked about there are tax collectors and sinners. And the only people who would associate with tax collectors would be other tax collectors or sinners that are the most outcast of society, much like this woman was known to be, in many cases, a prostitute or something of like manner. So that's who we're dealing with. And Luke is going to contrast their stories as Jesus, get this, we think the sinful woman is the focus of the story, but it's the sinful woman and it's Simon. And there are very different things we can learn from both. I think you might just find yourself, at least a little of yourself, in both of them. First thing I want you to know from verses 36 through 40 is that God's grace meets us where we are. Folks, I am thankful for God's grace this morning. Are you thankful for God's grace this morning? I need the grace of God every single day, and God gives it to me freely. And you need to know this story, the theme really isn't the sinful woman. The theme really isn't the sinful Simon, the Pharisee. The theme is God's grace. And a lot of times we look at grace as this thing to be obtained, but I came to tell somebody today that grace is a person, and his name is Jesus. He is the author and the finisher of our faith, and he is the theme of this story and of yours. If you're going to celebrate it, celebrate it. Let's celebrate that Jesus. He is grace personified today. And I'm thankful that that grace is something that he has allowed me to partake in my life. And so in verse 36, let's unpack this story. The first thing we'll see is that God's grace meets us where we are. It meets the sinful woman where she is, but it also meets Simon where he is. But verse 36, today I want to talk to you about the best seat. The best seat. Maybe you come to find the best seat at church. And by the way, we don't have assigned seats. Some of you sit in your same seat, but we sit wherever. I know I do the same thing. We're creatures of habit, aren't we? But maybe you come early because you want to sit in this seat or that seat or whatever that may look like. But what's the best seat? In verse 36, it says Jesus found his spot at the table. You see that? One would think that's probably the best seat, wouldn't you think? We're going to unpack that and maybe see a little bit of a different angle as we go through this story. But to do that, you really don't get the power of this story unless we get together the context and the history and what is going on in meals during this day and time during this story. And so I want to unpack some of that. The first thing, verse 36, you see that they reclined at the table. And they didn't have a lazy boy, and they didn't pull the little side out and out goes the feet. That's not the kind of recline. So when people during this time would sit at the table, it would be something like this. They'd sit down, there'd be cushions down here. And some of you are like, man, I'm glad we have chairs nowadays, aren't you though? But we sit and their feet would go back this way. Their elbow would often go down on the cushion or maybe stay up at the table, but their feet would go back away from the food because their feet, well, they stank and they were dusty and they don't want feet near the food, and they're reclining because this is how they would do. But what that means is that their feet were actually away from the table, and so anyone around the table would actually be closer to the feet of the people reclining at the table than they would to the actual table itself. Does that make sense? You say, well, that doesn't make any difference to me. It will in a minute if you hang in for a minute, because they weren't sitting this way. We think of this, that they're sitting up. No, their feet, they're reclined at the table, and that is where Jesus sat. And as Jesus sat there, she was behind him, we learned in this story, and we'll unpack why that's so meaningful, because here's the thing. Enter the sinful woman. His feet were away from the table. Verses 37 and 38, it says she was standing there weeping, and she was not invited. And you say, well, why is she at the house of a Pharisee? She wasn't. It's important to know that a meal like this likely was even taking place after Jesus, who was often a guest rabbi, a teacher, a guest preacher in the synagogues. And a good Pharisee would take that guest rabbi into his home and feed him a meal after church. And so I take free meals too. I'm not even a guest, and I'll still do that. But that's what would often happen. And Jesus, likely even on this day, was a guest speaker in the synagogue, and the Pharisee, Simon, brought him to his house. But the thing is, that sinful woman, she couldn't set foot inside the home of a Pharisee. There's no way that would ever be allowed. But they would eat, and archaeology has uncovered what their homes looked like in a courtyard area outside. So they were reclining at a table that was outside in a courtyard kind of area. And you say, well, why does she show up? Does she just come in and just kick the door in and say, I'm here? No, she came probably with a lot of other people because they were outside and because Jesus was so well known everywhere he went. And in fact, even non-well-known rabbis or teachers, when they would gather together, people in the town would hear, and even though they didn't have a place at the table, they would often come and surround the table in that courtyard area close to the feet of those who were sitting there to lean in and listen to the conversations. That wouldn't be that uncommon. And so she comes in that kind of a manner. That's how she's there. She's not invited, but she shows up because obviously something had happened with this Jesus that has changed her. And so she is there, and she has an alabaster flask of ointment. Alabaster would not be cheap, and the ointment would not be something that you would not smell or that you would smell in a subtle manner. It would be something that would be very noticeable. It would be a big sacrifice for her, and it would also be something that was very noticeable to smell for the people in the room. So it's important to know that. And you say, well, oh, that's kind of sweet. She was kind of inconspicuously in the back. No, this was a pretty big spectacle. First of all, she's that kind of sinner. Whatever that kind of sinner is, she's known to be that. But verse 38, what's the word there? She was doing what? She was kind of crying just a little bit, a few tears dripping. Is that what it says? Weeping. And that word weeping in the Greek is to howl, to wail, to loudly cry, to lament, to mourn. And so this was a big spectacle. Allow me to demonstrate. It wasn't what it's not. I'm not going to go, well, I might. I don't know. It depends on how well you listen. It was not this. It was a wailing, a weeping, a screaming kind of cry that made this whole thing a spectacle. Everybody knew she was there. She had this alabaster flask. She's not supposed to be there anyway. She's at the religiously elite's house, and she is making a huge scene. And Jesus should have done something about it, right? Well, he didn't. And that's what made this story so interesting. But listen, you're like, wow, this story makes a lot more sense. I'm not done. It got way worse. What was she doing? She was crying, and she was at the feet of Jesus, and her tears were wetting his feet. And then what does it say she did? She did something. You got to help me preach. I preach way longer when you don't help. Now you're listening. Hey, well, good morning. Welcome to Black Hawk. Right? So she's wiping Jesus' feet with her hair. She can't do that. In this culture, a woman cannot, under any circumstance, let her hair down. But to wipe his feet with her hair had to be down. And in this culture, this was so true that even if a woman that's married to a husband, she, first of all, wouldn't do that except in their own home, likely even in the bedroom, let her hair down. You just didn't do that. It's not so for us today. It was for them, but that changes the complexion of the story, doesn't it? It was so true that in this culture, even if a woman's hairpin accidentally fell out and she's in public, then a husband by law has the right to divorce her. You're like, whoa, this story is way more interesting than I thought, right? So now we've gone from a spectacle to a scandal. And Jesus does nothing about the scandal. What's wrong with this rabbi? Isn't he Jewish? Doesn't he get the law? Yet Jesus sat there and did nothing. But before you judge Simon too quickly, what would you have done? I don't know what I would have done if I was Simon. He at least kind of remained quiet, and all he did was think something. I would have been thinking something too. But so what we see is that Jesus met the woman in her sinfulness, but then he also, verses 39 and 40, met Simon in his sinfulness too. As we look at this, interesting enough, I love the Bible. Have I told you that lately? I love the Bible. If you hadn't read it in a while, you should read it. I read this passage over and over and over. I've read it over and over and over throughout the years, and every time I do it, God speaks to me in a different way. He shows me some new thing that's in there. And so, little side commercial, if you hadn't read the Bible lately, pick it up this week. I challenge you. Now, whole other sermon, back to today's regularly scheduled broadcast, is that Simon, do you know what his name means? Simon's name, I find it so ironic, means one who hears. And boy, is he about to get an earful. His name means one who hears. And so he is there. And verse 39 really indicates that Simon probably doesn't really believe Jesus is who he says he is, as we know from the other meals that Jesus has with Pharisees. And boy, I'm going to tell you, some of the meals that are coming up with the Pharisees, they're brutal. Jesus just rips them to shreds. And we're going to see why even in this story. But Simon says, if he was the prophet that he says he is, basically, he would have known who this woman is, what kind of woman this is, a sinner, if he was a prophet. And so obviously he's at least scoping it out, maybe trying to trap Jesus like the other Pharisees did. But here's what a Pharisee's goal was. It's a good goal. A Pharisee's goal was to be good and godly and to remain unstained and untainted and uncontaminated by ungodliness in the world around them. And you're like, it's pretty good. Jesus is hard on. Why is he so hard on them? It's interesting that that's their goal, and they do it really pretty well, yet Jesus is harder on them than anybody else in Scripture, anybody else in his life and ministry. Jesus frequently points out how even though they look the part, their heart is far away from God. And that's what's happening in this same story. Jesus continually does that. And I want you to know this, that it is possible. If you're like me and you grew up in church, especially for us, church kids, PKs, people who had the drug problem going to church. I always say I had a different kind of drug problem. They drugged me to church Sunday through Saturday every time the doors were open. Maybe you're like me, that it's possible to know how to be obedient, yet lose the capacity to love. Let me put it a different way for you. It's in your notes. Write this down. It is easy to confuse appearance with transformation. I want to let that soak for a minute. Let's talk about two different angles of that. Number one, I got to say, as a pastor, I've met people, some of you, I'm not pointing them out because you'll come after me later, but when I first see people on Sunday, I'm like, man, there's no way they're walking with Jesus. Man, they're so far away from Jesus, and I see all kind of stuff from up here. I see when you doze off or pick your nose or whatever is going on. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not really, or I do. But there's times where I meet somebody, and I think they've got to be so far away from Jesus. And then, listen, I hear their story. I hear your story. And then I come to realize that they look so far away from God. They appear to be so far away from Jesus. And then I hear your story and how you're striving, and how you didn't have the background that I had, yet I judged you through that lens. And then I walk out of church some Sundays going, they've got to be walking with God closer than I am. Their appearance didn't look like transformation. But sometimes we get those things confused. Let's flip it around. Did you know that you can have your best church smile? Put your best church smile on for me. Let me see it. And those of you who don't know the church smile, I talk about it all the time because we do it. We have a knockdown, drag-out fight. We've had an awful week, and we're all broken and smelly and terrible and awful. And then we step foot into the parking lot, and we go, hey, brother and sister, welcome to church, because we got to look the part at church. Listen, it's easy to confuse appearance with transformation, because sometimes, like Simon, we may look the part, but we couldn't be farther away from where God wants us to be in our life. We may know Jesus. We may have been transformed by Jesus, but that transformation has gotten put on pause in our life because we've decided to go our own direction. It's easy to confuse appearance with transformation. It's one of the points of this story as we look at Simon and his journey in this place today. It's so true of us spiritually in our life. You can get there in a hurry. But look at verses 39 and 40. Simon thought to himself. He thought to himself, well, if he was a prophet. And yet Jesus, and what did I tell you earlier? Grace, God's grace meets us where we are. And I came to tell you today that Jesus, in his grace, knows where you are. So Simon thinks this to himself. Jesus says, hey, Simon, I want to tell you something. And what is he going to say other than, say it, teacher? But he answers his thoughts. Why? Because God's grace will meet us where we are. I want you to know today that God's grace, you ready for it to get personal? You're like, well, this has been good, nice context and history. No, this is for you. God's grace knows where your head is this morning. Let me make it more personal. God's grace, Jesus knows where your heart is this morning. But his grace will meet you right where you are. I'm thankful for that kind of grace. He's in Simon's head, he's in Simon's heart, he's in my head, and he's in my heart as he in yours. Verses 41 through 50, we see the second thing. God's grace will meet you where you are, but now God's grace will multiply love. God's grace will multiply love in your life. This is so powerful for us. It's going to change how you see who you are and how you see who they are and how you see Jesus if you'll let it infiltrate your heart. Verses 41 through 43, Jesus gives a parable. Simon, one who hears, is getting an earful now. And he tells this parable, does Jesus, of two debtors, two people that owed money to the same lender. One owed 500 denarii. Now, that would be the equivalent of just less than 2 years' wages. So that's massively significant. And then the other owed only 50 denarii, which is just less than 2 months' wages during this time. Both significant, but different levels, right? But it's interesting that they were actually both in the same boat because it says, verse 42, they could not pay. Did you notice that? And he tells that story, and Simon doesn't quite get it at the time, but Jesus is making a tie to both the sinful woman and to Simon. Now, you may wonder, why did Jesus use money? What's the point of that? We're talking about sinfulness. Why did Jesus use money? In the Aramaic language, it's important to know that sin and debt, or sin and this money that is owed, are used interchangeably. And so Jesus is using a parable about money to get to the heart of sinful people, and he talks about two different kinds of sinful people. And I brought some amazing artistry skills with me today. Are you ready for them? I want you to see. I'm going to illustrate this a little bit for you. We're going to get this on the screen for those of you who can't see it. So here we go. This is water. You're going to be drowning in just a moment. Who's impressed already? All right. Now, so here's the thing. That's not a whole lot of water. We'll call this here to the surface, to the bottom. This is 50 feet of water, right? Isn't that beautiful? All right. And then up here, we're going to go way up to the top. A lot higher level of water here. You wish you could draw like that, didn't you? And this is not 50. This is 500 feet. All right, you got it? Pretty simple illustration so far. Here's where it's going to get personal. Here are you. I'm going to give you a frowny face because you're drowning. There you are. Who's impressed? I mean, come on, give it up for that artistry. You know you wish you could do it that way. All right, so here's what Jesus is teaching you here. There you are. Now, I want to ask you a question. How many of you or would be glad you were in 50 feet of water at the bottom versus 500 feet of water? How many of you would be glad? Well, but you're drowning and you're tied down and you have weight that you can't. All right, now let me ask you it a different way. You can't move. Now, how many of you think that this is worse than this if you're stuck at the bottom? Anybody? Why? I mean, this is way higher than that. There's a lot more water. Do you know how, I mean, if you did the math nerds in the room, a lot more weight on your head down here and you're drowning and you don't think this is better? Why? Because you're still drowning. And Jesus is showing Simon that yes, you may be here and your debt and your sinfulness that you are drowning in may be 50 feet and hers may be 500 by volume, but either way, you're drowning. And that is where we are. And so many times, especially in American church culture, we get to the tables of our lives and we say, well, you know what? I only have 50 feet of sin and they have 500, so I'm more elite. I'm superior to them. Jesus says, no, you're at the bottom and you're drowning and you need grace, but my grace will meet you where you are. And my grace will multiply love in your life because the more you understand how loved you are, the more capacity you have to love other people who, just like you, are drowning. May we invite people to the table realizing we're all in the same boat. And that's what Jesus is teaching Simon in this story as we look at it here. You should know this. You can't love if you can't see. You can't love if you can't see. And Jesus is trying to help Simon see where he is, see that he is sinful, even though his sin. So really the difference here is that the woman's sin was outward, it was public, but the sin of pride for Simon the Pharisee was internal, and you couldn't see it as much, and he could cover it up so much better. But you should understand today, we've got to get that humility is the key to being able to see our sinfulness. We've got to humble ourselves. Look at me first, realize, you know what? I'm drowning. I got nothing to say about the one that may be in 500 or 5,000 because the more you dig into this illustration, the more you realize I'm under 5,000 feet of sinfulness and water. And to be saved, you got to first understand what you're being saved from, that you need to be saved. But so many times we get into this religiously elite mentality where we think I'm not as bad as they are. Well, I know what they did last weekend, and so I must be okay. And Jesus says, no. Not so. And he's teaching it to Simon and he's teaching it to us. And verse 45, I want to break apart verses 44 through 46 for you. But verse 45, I find it interesting that she got there early. She got there early. How many of you are early birds? You show up early to everything. How many of you, that's you, okay. Now, the rest of you who didn't raise your hand, we know where you stand. It's okay, we're not even gonna pick on you today. But it's interesting, you say, how do you know she got there early? The Bible doesn't say that. Yeah, it does. Verse 45, look at what Jesus said. Verse 45, he said, since I arrived, she has not ceased kissing my feet. So that means since he got there, she was there. She was early because she was eager. That's what I want us to learn. Am I picking on late people? Well, maybe a little bit. You should come to church on time. But Jesus loves you even if you don't come to church on time. That's not the point. The point is we should, just like this woman, pick up the I see a lot of elbows. Don't be doing that. We're talking about Pharisees. Don't be one. But Jesus wants us to be eager, just like this woman. She was so eager. She was there when he arrived, and she couldn't stay away from Jesus because he's changed her life so much. May we be just as eager as this sinful woman who we all are at the bottom of the drowning of our sinfulness. And then verses 44 through 46, Jesus gives three ways that really this sinful woman outgraced, if you will, outgraced Simon the Pharisee. And so you got to know all three of these things were very customary things that you would do as a guest comes into your home. And obviously, because of how Jesus tells this story and how Luke records that account of the story, Simon chose not to do these things, but the woman who is so sinful didn't just do those things, but took them to a new level. And Jesus is going to use it to teach us a lesson. Number one, three things. He said, you gave me, Simon, no water for my feet, yet she used her tears for my feet. Number two, you gave Simon no kiss to me. They would give a kiss to welcome you into the home. You gave me no kiss, yet since I arrived, early and eager, since I arrived, she has not ceased to kiss even my feet. And then number three, you gave no ointment or no oil for my head. You didn't anoint my head with oil when I came in, yet she has poured out this ointment over my feet. And Jesus talks about how she loved him so deeply. And you need to understand, like I, that verse 47, we got to go there because some people misinterpret this part of the passage. Verse 47 says, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. Now, a lot of people go, oh, so Jesus forgave her because she loved him much. That is one of the biggest lies that people in today's culture buy into, that if I love Jesus enough, if I do enough good, then Jesus will love me and his grace will meet me where I am. That is not what Jesus is saying. Allow me to prove it to you. I'll tell you what he's talking about. He's saying, listen, her sins, which are many, big, deep, vast, drowning in sin. They're big, they're many, they're forgiven. And you know how you know it? It's because you can see her love for me. The love follows the forgiveness. But so many times we get this the other way around. The word for is saying that there is evidence of the forgiveness that's in her life. Let me prove it to you further. The next thing that Jesus says is he gives the contrast to this. He says, but he who is forgiven little loves little. So many times we buy into this lie, and may we never be these kind of Christians that think we've got to work our way into God's grace, because let me tell you what's going to happen. You'll work and you'll fall flat on your face time after time after time, and you will live a defeated life that never pours out the kind of love that God has called you to pour out. Why? Because you're giving the kind of love that you can muster up, but my Jesus in his grace will meet you where you are, fill you up so much that you love in an outflow and overflow of forgiveness, and the grace that met you where you are will then multiply love in your life, the love that you never even could attain on your own. That's what Jesus is teaching us. Yet we get it so backwards so many times. You need to understand this. Write this down, that God's forgiveness precedes and enables love. The more we understand God's grace in our own life, and my heart hurts for so many religious people, and my heart hurts because I've been one. Probably am one in ways I don't even realize today. If I'm honest, we're so far from perfect. But I've seen so many religious people get so critical and so negative and so consumed by what they think should be that they miss what God is doing in their life. My heart hurts for you if that's you. I watch people in this place, I watch people in my life who just go through life so miserable. And I beg of you, stop it. Stop and turn to Jesus and realize how much he loves you and realize how great his grace is for you, because the more you understand how much he has forgiven you in your sin, the more you are able to look at somebody else like the sinful woman, and hopefully like Simon could have done, but to say, you know what, I don't know their story, but I know how forgiven I am, so the least I could do is love them, and the least I could do is just give preference to them, putting them, esteeming their needs above my own, because Jesus did that for me. That's the call of our church. That's the call of come to the table. Religion says, I love. Religion says, I'm forgiven, rather, because I'm loved. But Jesus in relationship says, I love because I'm forgiven. May we get the order right. May we hear Jesus and his grace for who he is and what he's trying to teach us. Write this down. Grace leads to gratitude. You want 4 words that'll sum it up? Grace leads to gratitude. It's got to start with grace, for it turns into the gratitude and loving other people. The word peace in verse 50 reminds us that it's forgiven people that forgive, love people that love. Grace received leads to grace given. But peace is shalom. It is completeness. It is wholeness. It is that nothing is missing in our lives. That's what this story concludes with, but it started with faith. Verse 50, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. I want to give you 3 questions to ask yourself. What does this mean for me, Pastor? I'm going to give you 3 questions to ask yourself that'll help you grow in grace this week. Question number 1 comes from verse 41, which is where we see the 500 denarii and the 50 denarii. And it is, how do I see myself? How do I see myself? You say, was this a self-esteem talk? No, but you know where your esteem, you know where your confidence, you know where your contentment, you know where your identity comes from when you dig into this, is how you see, first of all, in humility. Are you humble enough to see that you're drowning? To be saved, you got to know you got to be saved from something, that you're in a mess. And how I see myself will lead to these second things. Verse 44, we see, how do I see them? Question number 2. How do I see them? You say, well, who's them? You know. those people God's called you to love that you're struggling to do so with right now. In verse 44, Jesus said to Simon, Simon, do you see this woman? Last week, I talked to you about theaomai, was the Greek word in Luke 5:27 when Jesus saw Levi. And that word is to behold, to view, to stare intensely, and it's where we get our word theater. This word, where Jesus says to Simon, do you see this woman, is not the same word. It is blepo, the Greek word that simply means the ability to see. It's to see. It's used 137 times in the New Testament. And why does that matter? Because it's so often associated with our ability, like a blind man, to be able to receive sight. So Simon is being asked by Jesus, are you going to be able to get beyond yourself, to get past the pride that holds you back, to makes you oblivious to your own sin, to be humble enough to find the ability to see this woman? You see her sin, but I see her soul. And when you get past yourself, you can invite her to the table as I have done. Will you have the ability to let Jesus bring sight to your blindness? And some of you I know, like me, are sitting here and you're like, well, I see fine. 2020 here. And I came to tell you, you're still blind. You still need the sight of Jesus to open your eyes. And I'm thankful that he wants to open our eyes. So how do you see them? The last question comes from verse 49. It's how do I see him? Jesus. This is the foundation of what will lead you to see yourself. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, because if you don't love yourself, you can't love your neighbor. How you see yourself, how you see your neighbor ultimately lands and derives from how you see Jesus. Verse 49, I love that those at the table come to the table today. Those at the table, it says, verse 49, began to say among themselves, who is this? Who even forgives sins? Who is this Jesus? And I'll tell you, as we wrap this up together today, that we talked about the best seat. And we thought it was where Jesus sat. But, there's in some 10 verses, there's some 10 references to the feet of Jesus. Like, this is a stanky passage. But Jesus' feet, Luke wants us to understand very fully that it's at the feet of Jesus where we find refuge and rest. And I believe the best seat at the table was at Jesus' feet. You thought it was at the table with the cushions where it was comfortable. But I believe, just like it was for the sinful woman, it is for us, that the best seat is at his feet. May we sit there together, church. Bow your heads with me and close your eyes as we reflect. What does this mean for me in this place today? What's God teaching me today? I believe he's got something very special for you. And some of you are here and you would say today that, you know what, I know Jesus, I've been invited to his table and I'm a believer, but gosh, I've got some things to do. I've got some work I've got to put in. I need desperately to take a step to invite somebody to the table this week, to know that God's grace meets me where I am, but it's time for it to start multiplying some love where I've been withholding it in your life. If that's you in this place and you say, man, God's really put something on my heart, I got a person on my heart, would you lift your hand, say, pray for me, Pastor? All across the building, lift it high, be bold. You got a step you need to take. You're a believer and you got to take a step. Good for you. Thank you for your boldness. You can put your hands down. Some of you are here though, and you would say, you know what, my come to the table invitation today is to understand grace. Through this passage, I've understood it in a different way. And I thought I knew I was saved, and I hope maybe I still do, but I need to know that I still do. And you're here today and you don't know that you know that you know that if you were to die, you would spend eternity with God in heaven because of a personal relationship with Jesus. You've turned from you being the source of your salvation, but turned to Jesus and his grace. God's word reminds us that it is by grace through faith that we are saved. It's not of ourselves, or then we would just boast about it. If that is you today, the good news of the gospel is that Jesus paid the price for your sin after living the sinless life that you could never, ever live on your own. You're separated. You're drowning in your sin, like the drawing. But Jesus came and lived the sinless life. He who knew no sin became sin so you could become the righteousness of God. Become it today. He paid that price, and while he hung on the cross, he thought of you. He thought of this moment, and you feel it stirring in your heart now because the Holy Spirit is prompting you to take a step today. And then he rose from the dead. Jesus is alive, and because he lives, you can have eternal life. Your role in all of this, receiving the gift, is turning away from you. Repent, the Bible says. It means to turn away from you being the source of your salvation and turn to Jesus, trusting in him as your Savior. And that looks a lot of different ways. You say, I can't pray it like you said it, and God doesn't want you to. He wants you to pray it from your heart. Give him your heart. Give him your life. Surrender to him if you've never done that in this place, and he will save you. If that's you, don't wait another moment. Cry out.